All right, this is the overview session for the Lecture 2 exam, and it covers Chapter 5 and 6 in your OpenStax textbook. So I'm going to get started, so just give me 5 seconds to share my screen. There we go, and now you see what I see. And here is our lecture content, and of course, we've already done Lecture Module 1, we're in Lecture Module 2, and there's the two topics, the integumentary system and the skeletal system. So I'm going to scan through the lecture notes for each of these two topics. And the lecture notes are found, I'll click on the integumentary system here. The lecture notes are found right there, right? And in the other topic, the skeletal system, right here, right, you can find the lecture notes. So that's what I'm going to be going through. It's a really good summary of the chapters and what you need to know. Of course, watch all the videos, right? There's a bunch of tutorial videos. Then I post my videos. So all of these videos help explain those lecture notes. So I'm assuming you've already watched them and just want another overview. But let's start going through it. If I need a picture, I'm going to use the PowerPoint I use in my lecture videos to show you pictures. So that's where I get the pictures from as I'm going through this. So let's start with the lecture notes from the integumentary system. And of course, you can read through all these, and I'm just going to hit certain things, some things that might require a little more explanation. I'm going to start with the skin or the integument, and you should know the functions of the skin, and they're listed here. Number one is protection, and as you're reading through this, I think one thing that gets forgotten sometimes is as part of protection that the skin is waterproof. Um, Water doesn't enter our bodies through the skin, but it also doesn't leave our bodies through the skin. That prevents dehydration. So how it's waterproofed, we have this oily film of what are called glycolipids, and that prevents the water loss. And that's an often forgotten function in this protection category. The skin also regulates our body temperature, right? A couple of ways. One is by dilating the blood vessels in the dermis. And when those blood vessels dilate, there's more blood near the surface of the skin, and that heat from the blood can then dissipate out into the atmosphere, cooling you down. And just the opposite, if we need to conserve heat because it's cold, well, those blood vessels can then constrict, and therefore, there it is, constrict, and therefore keep the blood more into the core of our body, keeping us warm, preserving the heat. But besides using our blood vessels, our skin also has sweat glands, which we call sebaceous glands. And of course, they secrete perspiration. That doesn't cool you down, but when that perspiration evaporates off of your skin, well, that is a cooling mechanism from the body. And you can see there's three other functions here. One thing I'll mention, because this one gets kind of forgotten sometimes too, is that our skin does have a metabolic function. It makes vitamin D, or a precursor to vitamin D at least. And the catalyst for that is the sun. So the UV rays from the sun stimulate the production of vitamin D by the skin cells. So just often forgotten function, just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. So when we go through the structure of the skin, there's two main layers of the skin. You got the epidermis right here at number one. If I were to scroll down, there's the dermis. Now we can subdivide the epidermis into strata. You see stratum, spinosum, stratum. We can just keep going, right? And then we can subdivide the dermis into two sublayers, papillary and reticular layer. Then deep to the skin, we have a hypodermis, which is not a skin layer, but is deep to the two skin layers, the epidermis and the dermis. So what you should know with all of this, I'm going to go over some more specific things in here, but first, what type of tissue is in each portion? Well, the entire epidermis, no matter which stratum you're in, basale, spinosum, and so on, the entire epidermis is stratified squamous. And we see that here. Keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Now, when we get into the dermis, these two sublayers have different types of tissue. The papillary layer, I'll go back up here, contains areolar, and you should know these tissues from lab, so we already had our exam in lab. And then that was the papillary layer, but the reticular layer of the dermis contains dense irregular connective tissue. And then when we go to the hypodermis, which is actually not part of the skin, well, that's mainly adipose tissue. Some areolar, but mainly adipose. So those are the different types of tissue involved in the skin, and the hypodermis, which is below the skin. And just to get into a little more specifics here with the epidermis, I'm just going to use an image. Let's see. There we go. So there's the epidermis, right? And there's the dermis down here. So there's your keratinized stratified squamous. The papillary layer is just this superficial part of the dermis, right? You can see the dermis. There's the papillary layer, just where all these little bumps, these dermal papilla, are located. That's areolar, right? But most of the dermis, the reticular layer, all of this is irregular dense. Now, when we get to the hypodermis, which is not skin anymore, you can see that it's mainly adipose tissue. When we look at the epidermis, right here, right, there's the epidermis. It's made up of all of these strata, which means layers. Well, this first row of cells, stratum basale, these cells are just going to divide, right? That's their job. And these new cells get pushed up, forced into this second layer, which is called the stratum spinosum. And most of these cells produce keratin and fill up with keratin, which is tough and waterproof. Uh, they're called keratinocytes. And as they get pushed up towards the surface, you can see this gets darker up here. That's because these cells are starting to die because the epidermis does not have a blood supply, right? The blood supply is in the dermis. Therefore, oxygen and nutrients have to diffuse up into the epidermis. So by the time all that good stuff gets way up here, it's already used up, right? So the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum find diffusion will allow oxygen and nutrients to get there, but only so far, right? So that's why they start breaking down at this point, and that's the stratum granulosum, a few, three to five cells thick. Then everything superficial to that is just packed dead cells, packed keratin, right, which gives skin its tough and waterproof properties there. Now we see most of this is stratum corneum, but there's a small little clearer section right here called the stratum lucidum, but we only see that, like you can see here, in thick skin. It says this thin layer is only found in thick skin, and that's in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So other than that, there is no stratum lucidum, right? So if you asked how many layers are there in the epidermis, 4 or 5. Are they asking you for thin skin? Then there's 4. But if they're asking you for thick skin, palms of the hands, soles of the feet, well, then there's 5 because stratum lucidum would be included there. All right, so these are the different types of cells that you should know that make up the epidermis. By the way, these cells in the epidermis are part of your nervous system. So even though there's no blood supply in the epidermis, it is innervated because you have receptors for light touch in your epidermis. Let's see. Yeah, probably one more thing I should mention here. There's this is stratum basale, here's stratum spinosum. There's cells that I hadn't mentioned in the stratum spinosum. Most of them are keratinocytes that produce keratin, but there's some dendritic cells. They're usually called dendritic cells. What they do is they help to fight infection along with these big phagocytes called macrophages. So these are the two cells, dendritic cells and macrophages, that are part of your immune response if something is trying to invade us right through the skin. Stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum. Remember, stratum lucidum is only in thick skin, palms of the hands and soles of the feet, and then the stratum corneum, which is keratinized, all that dead cell material and keratin on the superficial surface. Then we get to the dermis. The main cells in the dermis that we have the most of are fibroblasts because they secrete fibers like collagen for strength and elastic, and reticular fibers as well. There's also macrophages, right? So there's fibroblasts and macrophages to fight infection in the dermis. And there's the papillary layer, which we said is areolar connective tissue. And the reticular layer, which is most of the dermis, is dense irregular connective tissue. The hypodermis is deep to both skin layers, but is not considered part of the skin, and it consists of mostly adipose tissue. Right? There's some areolar, but it's mostly adipose tissue. There's accessory organs in the skin. Here we see an image of a hair, and there's a hair follicle going into the dermis. So the shaft is what you see. When it becomes hidden into the skin, it's called the root. There you see hair root, and where it bulges at the base, we call that the bulb, and the matrix are the cells that produce the keratin, right, to produce the hair. Keratin, just like the skin produces keratin. We have oil glands in the skin that we call sebaceous glands because they secrete an oil called sebum, and that's where it gets its name as sebaceous glands. So what you see in italics, they are not found on the palms of the hands and sole of the feet. So the sebaceous glands are throughout our entire body except palms of the hands, soles of the feet. And we just heard about palms of the hands, soles of the feet. That's thick skin. That's where we see stratum lucidum. So where we have the stratum lucidum, we don't have sebaceous glands. Sudoriferous glands, those are sweat glands. There's two types, but by a long shot, the most numerous sweat glands that we have that actually are there to cool us off when we're warm are the eccrine glands, the eccrine sweat glands, which you can see is mostly water, also a little bit of salt and a little bit of waste product in the sudoriferous glands, or the eccrine glands, I should say more specifically. And they open through pores onto the skin surface. So if we look at an image, there's an eccrine sweat gland, and you can see it has its own duct, which goes right to the surface of the skin. Well, an apocrine gland, let me go to one. So here's an eccrine sweat gland. An apocrine sweat gland, these ones we don't have very many of, and they start to function at puberty. And you can see in the axillary region, anogenital region, they secrete a substance, but not onto the skin, onto the actual hair shaft itself. And that's the way it exits the body. I should mention the sebaceous glands work that way. They secrete sebum out through the hair follicle as well, just like these apocrine sweat glands. So going back to the lecture notes, you can see apocrine sweat glands, right, armpits, etc., different from the eccrine sweat glands. And let's see. Oh, there's two types of modified apocrine glands, and they are ceruminous glands. They secrete cerumen, which is earwax, and they're just in the ear canal. Also, mammary glands are the same, or are modified apocrine glands that produce milk, for example. Okay, these are skin cancers, and there's three types of skin cancers that we look at here, and they are numbered from the least aggressive to the most aggressive. When we say cancer, that means cells are dividing uncontrollably and starting to invade underlying tissue or surrounding tissue. So uh, basal cell carcinoma, as you might imagine, is in the stratum basale, and those cells are supposed to divide, right? That's their job. But if they divide too quickly, um, it starts to invade the underlying tissue, and that is basal cell carcinoma, and that is the least malignant and the least aggressive of all the skin cancers. The one in the middle, squamous cell carcinoma, I'm looking where it says it here. Yeah, it's the keratinocytes. This says keratinizing epidermal cells, but those are the keratinocytes, the cells that secrete keratin. Well, they start to divide uncontrollably, which is where that cancer originates from, that stratum spinosum layer, right? And that's middle of the road aggressive. But melanoma, sometimes called malignant melanoma or just melanoma, that's a cancer of the melanocytes, and those are the pigment-producing cells that are found in the epidermis. They produce a pigment called melanin to protect the skin from UV light. If those cells start to divide uncontrollably and invade surrounding tissue, that's what melanoma is. And this metastasizes quickly, so it's the most aggressive of the three. Then we get to burns, and the most critical item that, or fear, I guess we can say, with burns, if it's a severe burn, is dehydration. Because recall that one of the protective functions of skin is to prevent water loss, right? Skin keeps your water inside your body. Well, if it's burned severely, well, all of a sudden it can't do that anymore, and we start to lose water, which can cause electrolyte balance and shock. So that's just a major factor with burns, is dehydration, severe burns at least. But we're going to start with a first degree burn. First degree burn, let's look at the depth of the damage. So if it's first degree, the epidermis only is damaged, but not totally destroyed. So the burn has entered this epidermis, our superficial layer of skin, and doesn't penetrate the entire epidermis, but is within it. So this is a minor burn, like a sunburn, doesn't really need much treatment. But a second degree burn, now the depth of tissue damage, the epidermis is destroyed and part of the dermis is destroyed. Not the entire dermis, but part of the dermis. So the burn has gone through the first layer, the epidermis, and now is into the dermis, is within the dermis, but not all the way through. This is a very painful burn, and of course you can read the major effects right here. Let me just turn my page and follow along. Yeah, so the key word here is part of the dermis. And then in a severe burn, which we call a third degree burn, as you can see, the depth of tissue damage, all skin layers destroyed. So the epidermis and the dermis are totally penetrated through by the burn. So it's in underlying tissue, the hypodermis, or even further, right? That's a third degree burn. So this is a very serious burn, which likely will require some skin grafting. And what probably it should say, I don't know if it does here or not, but the greatest immediate threat is dehydration in this third degree burn, which is why we need skin grafts in those situations. All right, so that's just a good overview, just sweep through of the material for chapter 5. Of course, we have to cover chapter 6 as well in this exam. Don't ignore things I didn't cover. I'm just kind of sweeping through, highlighting certain things. Chapter 6 is on the skeletal system. When I say chapter 6, that's a reference to OpenStack's textbook. So let's run through some items in this chapter. We're dealing with the skeleton, and part of the skeleton are the cartilages involved with the skeleton. So we should know the 3 types of cartilage and a little bit about each one, right? Which we already do because we covered these 3 types of cartilage in the lab when we cover tissues. But hyaline cartilage is the most abundant. We have more of this cartilage than any other type. It's at the ends of our long bones. It makes up our costal cartilage. That's our rib cartilage. Our ribs become cartilage before they connect to the sternum. We have cartilage in our respiratory system, like around our trachea. So there's a lot of hyaline cartilage throughout the body. What we have the least of is elastic cartilage. And we only find that in very specific locations like your outer ear, right? That bendy part on the side of your head, that's elastic cartilage in there. Also your epiglottis, that's a little piece of elastic cartilage that bends so that when you swallow, food doesn't go down the wrong tube. But other than that, there is no other elastic cartilage in the body. Fibrocartilage is named fibrocartilage because it has the most fibers, specifically collagen. So this is a very tough type of cartilage that we find between our discs, intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, which you'll be learning about in lab soon. And then in our knee joint, we have medial and lateral meniscus, which is fibrocartilage. There's a bunch of functions that I'm not going to go through all of these functions, but you should know them of bones. Of course, if you want details, you can go through the video. I'm just going to hit on certain things. Protection, of course, it's bone, so it's going to protect any organ that's deep to it, like the brain and the skull, inside the skull, the heart and the lungs, right? So many organs are contained within these cavities or spaces that is formed by the skeleton. Let's see, support, movement. This might require a little explanation here. So our blood cells are made within our bones. Our bone has a very rich blood supply, but blood cells are actually made inside of bone and it doesn't say here, but we'll see it a little later, red bone marrow. So we have yellow bone marrow, that's mainly adipose tissue, but we also have red bone marrow, which is red because, well, red blood cells are being made in that location. So that process is called hemopoiesis. Hemo means blood. Poiesis means forming, so we're forming blood. Sometimes you'll see hemato instead of hemo, so hematopoiesis. That means the same thing. Hemato and hemo both refer to blood, right? So that's a big function of bone is to make our blood, hemopoiesis. Our bones are a reservoir for calcium and other mineral salts like phosphorus. That's why bone is hard, because calcium that we get in from our diet, these mineral salts that we take in, get stored in bone and hardens it, right? Without those mineral salts, your bone would be more like cartilage, really bendy, right? But this inorganic portion of bone, calcium, is what makes it a hard tissue. Good, I'm gonna turn my page here. All right, so let's look at how we classify bones according to shape. You can see there's long, short, sesamoid, flat, irregular, and some accessory bones. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'm just going to touch on a couple things here. One, long bones. I'll use a picture. Long bones are only found in the limbs. All right, so there's the humerus, radius, ulna, all these hand and finger bones. Then again, your femur, your lower leg bones, bones in the toes. Yeah, those are your long bones. The only bones that are not long bones in the limbs are the wrist bones, which we call carpals, and the ankle bones, which we call tarsals. So besides the carpals and the tarsals, all the other bones in the limbs are considered long bones. The carpals and tarsals are considered short bones. And there's other reasons why these are long bones, other than the fact that they're long. And of course, the chapter and the videos will kind of make you aware of all of the aspects of long bone. But just kind of an interesting thing, yeah, they're all located in the limbs, the long bones. And only the wrist, carpals, and tarsal ankle bones are not long bones. Those are short bones. I say that because, well, the ribs look like they're long, but actually they're considered flat bones. Like these bones that make up your cranium are also considered flat bones. I'll go back to the notes. All right, so flat bones. I'm looking, it doesn't say it here. So I'm looking at sesamoid bones. No, it still doesn't say here. So I want to mention something about flat bones. There's a unique, probably says it somewhere else, but now that I'm thinking about it, let me scroll to the correct location here. Okay, so here's a flat bone, this is probably the parietal bone of the cranium. On the outside of bone, all of our bones, we have compact bone. You can see there's no holes in it. It's the entire surface of the bone, inside and out, is compact. But in the interior of sorry, flat bone, we see spongy bone. So this porous bone that we call spongy bone is where we find a lot of red bone marrow, where hemopoiesis takes place. But this pattern right here with the compact bone on either side and the spongy bone in the middle, like a spongy bone sandwich type of appearance, that's called diploe. And diploe is just where most of our red bone marrow is located, but it's that unique look to flat bone, the compact bone on the outsides with the spongy bone in the middle. And spongy bone is called that because, of course, it looks like a sponge. It's not soft. It's still hard tissue, but it has that porous appearance. So we want to look at the structure of long bone here. So if I go to the notes, I think that comes up next. Yeah, structure of long bone, a typical long bone. The diaphysis is the shaft. The epiphysis are the ends that bulge. And that transition area between epiphysis and diaphysis is the metaphysis, which includes either the epiphyseal plate or the epiphyseal line. And then we have articular cartilage on the epiphysis. So that was a lot to say right there without showing you what that means. So let's go to this image right here. So on the outside of bone, even long bone like we see right here, it's compact. But if we cut it open, we can see, well, there's an actual cavity in the shaft called the medullary cavity, and we call the shaft the diaphysis, where the ends that bulge, either end, is called the epiphysis. So this transition area right there where the epiphysis becomes the diaphysis, that's the metaphysis, which is not labeled here, but what is labeled is something called the epiphyseal line. And it's a line because it's just this bone separating the epiphysis from the diaphysis. Now, in someone that is still growing, meaning they haven't reached their full height yet, this line would not be bone, it would be cartilage, hyaline cartilage, just like the cartilage up here, which, by the way, this is hyaline cartilage as well. It's articular cartilage at the ends of our long bones. So if it was a drawing like this where the cartilage is blue, well, there would be a blue line separating the epiphysis and diaphysis. That means the bone is still elongating because bone cells, osteoblasts that produce bone, build bone into the diaphysis, elongating it from that epiphyseal plate. So when this is still cartilage and you're still growing, it's called an epiphyseal plate. We know this is an adult bone, and it's someone who is done growing because there's no more cartilage. At that point, we call it an epiphyseal line. So regardless, this is the metaphysis. If it's bone, specifically, it's an epiphyseal line. If it's cartilage, it's an epiphyseal plate, which sometimes we call a growth plate because that means person is not done growing yet. All right. And we can see the spongy bone in the interior of the epiphysis. The outside of bone is lined with periosteum. The inside is lined with endosteum, also lines the spongy bone as well, because that's also the interior. So if I go back to our notes, there's the diaphysis, epiphysis, metaphysis, which is either an epiphyseal plate, remnant of hyaline cartilage of growing bones, or an adult, an epiphyseal line like we saw in the picture. And then we have articular cartilage, which is that hyaline cartilage at the ends of long bones, so they don't wear out. Right, the periosteum is that outer lining of bone, and just inside the periosteum, we see, well, first off, that periosteum is just dense connective tissue. It covers the outer surface of bone completely. It has osteoblasts that build bone and osteoclasts that dissolve bone. So those are two types of bone cells. Just remember blast builds, or these cells are blasting out, I like to think of it that way, material, which is Not quite bone, it's very gel-like, because remember we said we need the mineral salts from our diet to mix with it in order for bone to harden. When we need to remove bone, those are the osteoclasts that can dissolve bones, and we call that resorption. And we'll see that word a little further along in these lecture notes. All right, of course, the compact bone makes out the outer surfaces. The spongy bone, right, consists of thin, irregular shaped plates of bone tissue called, and there's a key word, it's bold, trabeculae. So trabeculae, like you see here, is just that pattern, that porous pattern of spongy bone, and they describe it here, which is a nice description, a lattice-like network, which is that very kind of a random-looking pattern of the spongy bone. All right. So next thing, the chemical composition of bone. Well, we already mentioned that the osteoblasts produce the matrix, this gel-like substance, but it only gets hard when we take in mineral salts from our diet. So these are inorganic salts because we don't make them. We take it in from our diet. And it's mainly calcium, like calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate. Regardless, these are calcium derivative mineral salts that we sometimes called hydroxyapatite crystals. So when they join in with bone material, it changes from a gel-like material into a hard tissue, which we know of when we think of bone. All right, so in compact bone, we have a bunch of words here. Let's see, there's osteons, concentric lamellae, lacunae, canaliculi. Let's use a picture, perforating canals, and describe or figure out what all these terms are. So I'm going to scroll to where we see those structures. Here's a good picture here. Make it a little larger. There we go. All right, so when you look at bone, we have the compact bone at the outer surface, and as we move to the interior, well, there's spongy bone. But if we look at compact bone, it's arranged in these cylinders, and one's being pulled out here. Each unit is called an osteon. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one back there, 6 osteons. There's half of 2 osteons right there. So osteons is just one functional unit of compact bone, which is made up of these layers of bone, which we call lamella. A lamella, or lamellae plural, means layers. And the ones that are in the osteons, like these 3, are called concentric lamella, which we saw in the lecture notes because they're in a circular pattern. There's other lamella. We can see some layers filling in the space between osteons. We have other lamellae which go around the entire circumference of the bone, right? Circumferential lamellae, right? But these are concentric lamellae. And then we see in the center of the osteon a canal, right? And in the canal, we're looking inside the canal here, we have blood vessels, nerves. These are called central canals because they're right in the center of the osteon. You can see how vascular bone is as a rich blood supply and nerve supply. Now these canals that are not central canals, they're actually joining osteons together. Those are called perforating canals or Volkmann's canals. And if we look really close at an osteon, and I'm going to zoom in on one right here, right, we can see that there's these little spaces between these concentric lamellae. And if you look really close, we can see the nucleus of a cell. So there's a cell occupying that space. They're called osteocytes. These are mature bone cells. They used to be osteoblasts, and that's how they made this bone material, but there's no more room left. So they're trapped in their own little cave, which we call a lacuna. So we have osteocytes inside their lacuna, right? Because these osteoblasts are no longer secreting bone material, which is gel-like. When there's no space left, the osteoblasts become osteocytes. And they're in their lacuna, but they're not totally trapped because there's all these little canals. You can see looks like little cracks kind of joining them all together. So that's for blood supply to get to the osteocytes, right, from the central canal through these canaliculi right through there. Okay, go back to the lecture notes. So there's the write-up on all this material here. And of course, in spongy bone, we have the trabeculae. There's that word again. That's the bone itself. They don't have osteons, but they have osteocytes and lacunae. They're just not arranged in that cylindrical pattern like the compact bone is. I already mentioned the bone marrow, but here's the write-up on it. Remember, it's the red bone marrow that produces our blood cells, and that's the hemopoietic tissue, sometimes called hematopoietic tissue, and that's found in mostly in spongy bone. You remember diploe in the flat bones, and there's a few other locations of spongy bone where we have red bone marrow. We have yellow bone marrow, and that's just adipose tissue. That probably used to be red bone marrow when we were born, when we need to be making a lot of blood cells, but after a while, we don't need to make as much. We have a lot of areas where blood cells are made in bones. So yeah, wherever it's not needed, it just becomes yellow bone marrow, which is mainly adipose tissue. And it says, yellow bone marrow no longer produces blood, but it can revert back to red bone marrow if it needs to. For example, someone may lose a lot of blood for some reason, and therefore yellow bone marrow can quickly go back to red bone marrow to produce blood if that's a priority. All right, next section, the physiology of bone formation. So there's two types of bone formation, right? A bone formation could be called ossification. There's intramembranous and there's endochondral. So we need to know the difference between the two. So this is how our skeleton is formed. Like, how do we make our bones? We have 206 of them. Well, most of them are made this way, endochondral ossification. A few of our bones in our skeleton are made this way, intramembranous ossification. So let's see the difference between the two. So first off, intramembranous, just some specific bones that are in the skull and clavicles. That's it. So some flat bones in the skull and the clavicles, which are the collarbones, those are the only bones that are made this way, the intramembranous. And we're talking about in the embryo and fetus. That's how they're produced. So we have these stem cells called osteogenic cells, which when it needs to make the bone, the clavicles or the flat bones, those osteogenic cells become osteoblasts. And we know what osteoblasts do. They secrete the bone tissue called osteoid. There's the first time we saw what that was actually called, osteoid, which is very gel-like, a lot of collagen fibers, but then it gets calcified, right, with the minerals from a blood supply. So from the fetal blood supply, there's calcium that enters and hardens those bones. Of course, we have, it says number 5 here, clusters of osteocytes from calcified trabecular lattice work of spongy bone. There's the word diploe that I mentioned before that are found in the spongy bone inside flat bones. Okay, and then how most of our bones are formed is through endochondral ossification, which means in the cartilage, endochondral. So besides those flat bones of the skull and the clavicles, all your other bones take this route. So in an embryo, there's a skeleton that's made, but it's a cartilage skeleton. So we have a hyaline cartilage skeleton, and then that acts as a template for us to make bone out of. So just imagine this little hyaline cartilage model of a skeleton that gets converted into bone. So it's quite a process. So I'm not going to go through this entire process here. All right, that's not necessary. You can watch the videos and go through the process. But the big thing that happens is that lining around the cartilage, which is called a perichondrium, right? There's the perichondrial cells. They start making osteoids. So actually, it becomes a periosteum, the lining around bone. So that includes osteoblasts, which start secreting bone matrix. But the general story when we go through this whole thing here is that, yeah, bone is replacing the cartilage uh, template of the skeleton. So a couple important points I will highlight though is that the primary ossification center, so basically this is saying where bone is made first is in the diaphysis, which it says shaft here, but we know the better term for that is the diaphysis. So the diaphysis is the primary ossification center, and what's produced afterwards, the secondary ossification center, are the epiphyses. There's one at each end. That's why that's plural here. So the shaft is formed first, primary, and then the epiphysis at each end is the secondary ossification centers. However, we're still left with some cartilage, the articular cartilage and the epiphyseal plate. Let me show you this on an image. Give me a second to find it. Just scrolling. Almost there. All right, so here's a hyaline cartilage bone, whatever bone this is, and we can see it's already starting to become bone. There's the primary ossification center in the diaphysis, right? Then eventually we get the secondary ossification centers in the epiphysis, and you can see bone is starting to replace all the cartilage. This is at birth. Right here, we still have quite a bit of cartilage. And then shortly after birth, this is childhood. Look what the bone looks like. It's mainly bone, but we still have hyaline cartilage from that original hyaline cartilage bone from the embryo. So what's left over of that hyaline cartilage is the articular cartilage, which is at the ends of the long bones. So we see it at that end as well. And what we talked about earlier, the epiphyseal plate. And there's the one on the other side. So if we're still growing, we still have an epiphyseal plate and articular cartilage left over from that original hyaline cartilage skeleton. But once we're done growing, we already mentioned that this epiphyseal plate seals up with bone, and then that bone cannot elongate anymore, and you're done growing. So that would then be called an epiphyseal line. But this never goes away, right? This articular cartilage is there with you for your entire life. Right? So you're born with the epiphyseal plate and the articular cartilage, but the epiphyseal plate is gone when you reach full height. But however, your articular cartilage remains throughout your entire life. Good. All right. I'm just going to turn the page here. Covered that. Postnatal bone growth. We'll go through a couple things here. I think it says the metaphysis, but probably should call that the epiphyseal plate if we're still growing. All right. So that epiphyseal plate that faces the epiphysis contains cartilage cells that are dividing and pushed towards the diaphysis. So that means, yeah, growth takes place at that epiphyseal plate, and that new bone gets pushed into the diaphysis, elongating the shaft of the bone. And that continues to happen, right, as long as you're still growing. But once the bone is mature, it's stopped dividing, that epiphyseal plate becomes thinner, and it starts being replaced by bone. So when you have no more cartilage left, then we call it the epiphyseal line. Bones also grow in width, right? And that's called appositional growth, right? This is how they grow in length, interstitial growth, but they also grow in width. That's appositional growth. And that's just the osteoblasts inside the periosteum, that's the lining surrounding bone, periosteum, secretes osteoid, bone material, against the bone surface, right, making it wider. It's just a simple process there. These are different hormones that regulate bone growth. growth hormone, thyroid hormone, testosterone, and estrogen. There's one hormone I want to talk to you about in a little more detail, but we'll see that one a little bit later. Let's turn my page. I should mention what remodeling is. That happens throughout your entire life. Remodeling is osteoblasts adding bone, osteoclasts resorbing bone, right? Bone resorption is the word for breaking down bone. And your bones are continually remodeling, right? Bone's taken away here, it's added there. If you have more physical stress on a bone, your osteoblasts will add more bone there. If you're not using, if there's not much stress on a bone, your osteoclast will take it away. So remodeling occurs constantly, right, throughout your entire life. So here's that word I was talking about earlier, bone resorption. That's the process of dissolving bone, and it's the osteoclasts that do that, right? Clast means to break down, right? So it's the osteoclasts that break down the bone because they have special enzymes that dissolve the bone, and they will dump that calcium and mineral usually into the blood when bone is being resorbed. So that takes us to control of remodeling. And what I do want to go through is this one, the parathyroid hormone, with you guys here. And I'm going to find a picture to explain that. So give me a second to find it. All right, here it is. So first thing that I should mention is that your body monitors the level of calcium, not in your bones, but in your blood. That's where it's important. That's where many of our body's vital functions rely on this range of calcium in the blood. Right? We'll have nervous system problems, muscle problems, lots of problems if this homeostasis is not met. So calcium, very important to be within homeostasis in the blood, not the bone. Right? So if we need calcium in our blood, your body will not hesitate to take it from bone because it considers bone just a storage facility, right, for calcium. So let's go through this scenario. So all of a sudden, there's falling blood calcium level. So the blood calcium level dips down lower than it should be. So that's the trigger, low blood calcium, not bone, but low blood calcium for our parathyroid glands. What you see here is the thyroid gland, but those little dots on the back side of it, those are parathyroid glands, secretes a hormone, parathyroid hormone PTH, into the blood. So parathyroid hormone is traveling in the blood. It needs to get calcium in the blood. That's its job. So one of the places it goes to is your osteoclasts. And we know what osteoclasts do. They resorb bone. They perform resorption, which breaks down bone and takes that mineral salt, takes that calcium, and puts it into the blood to maintain homeostasis or go back to homeostasis. So this is a nice negative feedback cycle here. Just to generalize it, blood calcium levels drop, parathyroid hormone is released, that activates the osteoclasts to take calcium from the bone and put it into the blood. And that's a good summary. Now, if I go back to the notes, that's the wrong one. There we go. Parathyroid hormone maintains blood calcium levels, right? That is necessary. So what we just went through on that image is one of the ways it restores normal blood calcium, right? And that's what we describe, number 3. But PTH does a couple other things, right? It will go to the intestines and tell it to absorb more calcium, so we have more calcium in the blood from the food that you're eating. It'll also go to your kidney and it'll say, stop releasing calcium in the urine, we need it in the blood, right? So it'll prevent the kidney from getting rid of calcium. So it goes to 3 different areas in order to maintain proper blood calcium. But the one most that is relevant to this chapter, since this is on the skeleton, is, yeah, one of the places where PTH goes is to the bone to tell the osteoclasts to resorb bone and put the calcium into the blood. All right. Just a couple more things I wanted to cover here. bone repair. So if there's a fracture or a break in a bone, your bone goes through a 4-step process in order to uh, restore the bone, to heal the fracture. So if you want a little more detail, my video goes through the 4 steps in more detail, but the first step is a hematoma. And that's just a big pocket of blood that fills in the area where the break is, where the fracture is. Right? And then osteoblast will start secreting bone into that fractured site. So we get a callus, but remember when osteoblasts secrete bone matrix, it's very gel-like, kind of like cartilage, right? So it's called a fibrocartilaginous callus. And once that callus forms, well, bone is very vascular, so the mineral salts from the bone, from the blood, like the calcium, will then join up with this fibrocartilaginous callus and harden it, so we get a bony callus. Now that it's bone again, well, now we can start using this bone again, take the cast off, put stress on it, start using it, and then that bone will remodel with that stress now that we're using our arm or leg or whatever we broke. So those are the 4 stages. Hematoma first, then the fibrocartilaginous callus second, and then with our mineral salts, it becomes a bony callus, and then it will remodel so it looks like what it did originally. And this chapter ends with some disorders, and you could read through those. I'll just cover one here, like the osteoporosis is a bone softening disorder, could be a deficiency in calcium. I'm going to correct that. It is not a bone softening disorder. It's a loss of bone mass. Osteomalacia is bone softening. Osteoporosis, the bone doesn't soften. There's just less of it, making it more brittle. And what we know about remodeling is that, well, the more stress you put on the bone, the stronger it becomes. So that's why treatment always includes an exercise program to put physical stress on the bone, so your body, your osteoblasts will lay down more bone. Okay, well, that's a good sweep through or overview of, let me stop sharing, of the material for the Unit 2, or I should say Lecture Module 2 exam, and I think we're good. It's a multiple choice test, so you'll get your results right away. Don't forget to watch all the videos that will expand on what I told you here on this little overview session, and I hope you find it helpful, and good luck to you when you take it.